The Glasgow case of Mary McLaughlin begins in the soft grey light of Partick, and tonight you open the file gently, as if the paper itself has been waiting for your hands. Settle in and let the pace stay slow. We're only going to turn one page at a time. You can imagine the folder first, before the names become heavy. It sits under a small desk lamp, its corners softened by years, its label faded to that pale office yellow that old records seem to gather. The Glasgow case is written there in careful ink, not loudly, not with drama, just as a matter that once entered a police room and never really left. You hear the low hum of the building around you, the faint tick of a radiator, the dry whisper of paper as you lift the first sheet. Mary McLaughlin was 58 years old, a mother of 11, and in the autumn of 1984 she was living in Glasgow, in a city that could feel both close and private at the same time, life before it becomes a case at all. There are streets, buses, shops, a cup left near a sink, the smell of rain in wool coats, and then, much later, there are statements and photographs and dates. The date you write down first is the 27th of September, 1984. The ink feels dark on the page. Mary had been out that evening, and by the time anyone understood that something was wrong, the hours had already begun to separate themselves from memory. That is one of the quiet burdens in a cold case. Time starts working before anyone has asked it to. You turn the page slowly, and there is Glasgow again, not as a backdrop, but as a living place around the file. Partick streets, damp pavements, tenement stairs, the muffled sound of doors closing along a landing. In the notes, you can almost feel the cool air in a hallway, the grit underfoot, the shine of street lamps on windows after rain. Nothing here asks to be rushed. The details arrive softly, each one waiting its turn. Mary's body was found days later, after concern grew and family members looked for her. We won't linger on the manner of death, because this story is not here for fear. What matters tonight is the long work that followed, and the way patient hands kept returning to what remained. Investigators came into her home, and they did what investigators do. They looked, they listed, they sealed. They carried away what might one day speak. There were items from the flat. There were witness statements. There were fingerprints, impressions, routine notes, small marks of police work that must have seemed ordinary at the time. You can picture the evidence bags, slightly cloudy under fluorescent light, with labels written in ballpoint pen. There is a smell to that kind of room, a mix of old paper, dust, damp coats, and the faint chemical sharpness of sealed exhibits. If you've ever opened a box that has been closed for years, you know the feeling. In 1984, forensic science had tools, but not the tools we think of now. Detectives could compare prints, build timelines, interview neighbors, trace movements, and test certain materials with the methods available then. But DNA profiling was not yet the quiet engine it would become. It had not yet moved into police work in the way that, years later, would change old files all over Britain. So the Glasgow case had to begin with footsteps and notebooks. You follow those footsteps now. One officer might knock on a door and hear a television playing behind it. Another might stand in the stairwell, notebook open, while a neighbor tries to remember what time she heard someone pass. The paper in your hand records statements, but behind each statement there is a voice, a kitchen light, a kettle cooling, a person searching their memory. That's the human texture of an inquiry. It is not only evidence, it is people trying to help. The first investigation gathered more than 1,000 statements. You pause over that number, written out in your mind as a measure of labor rather than scale. More than 1,000 conversations, more than 1,000 small acts of recollection. Some would have been brief, some would have wandered, some would have carried certainty, and others only the soft fog of maybe. You can almost hear the scrape of chairs in interview rooms, the steady click of a pen, the tired politeness at the end of a long shift. For Mary's family, the file was not paper, it was absence. We should keep that close as we move through the case, because patient detective work is never only technical. It is also an answer ode to people who wake each morning with the same missing piece still in place. You and I can sit quietly with the folder, but they had to live beside the silence. That deserves care. In those early weeks, investigators worked with the urgency of a fresh case, though we tell it now in a softer voice. They looked for who had seen Mary. They looked for who knew her. They asked about visitors, habits, acquaintances, the ordinary patterns that make a life visible. Every old investigation begins by building a map of normal days, because only then can a strange hour be recognized. You trace that map with your finger, careful not to press too hard. The Glasgow case did not yield its answer then. Leads thinned. Names were checked and set aside. The city continued around the investigation, as cities do, with buses sighing at curbs and shop shutters rattling down in the evening. Files were updated, reviewed, placed in order, and then eventually stored. That is not the same as forgetting. A file in storage can still be waiting. But there was one more detail in the room, small enough to be overlooked by time, and patient enough to outlast it. You come now to the cigarette end, an ordinary object in the old paperwork, but one that would become central to the Glasgow case. Many years later, it was found in Mary McLaughlin's home, kept with other materials and preserved as part of the investigation. At the time, it could be noted, bagged and considered. Later, it would become something more. You hold that idea lightly, because cold cases often turn on things that once seemed quiet. A cigarette end has its own faint presence in a file. You can almost smell the stale tobacco, dry and ashy, caught inside a sealed packet for years. The paper is fragile. The filter is small. It doesn't look like an answer. It looks like something left behind in the ordinary mess of a room. Something that might have belonged to anyone unless careful work could say otherwise. That careful work was not ready yet. In the 1980s, detectives could understand that such an item might matter. They could preserve it, list it, and keep it from being lost. That act, simple as it sounds, is one of the quiet hinges of this story. You and I often think of breakthroughs as moments of brilliance, but sometimes the breakthrough begins with someone sealing a bag properly and placing it where future hands can find it. The patience starts early. The exhibit would have sat through changing years. Offices changed, officers retired, new computer systems came in. The air in record rooms shifted from tobacco and carbon paper to toner and plastic folders. Somewhere, the Glasgow case remained in the care of the system, not solved, but not gone. You can picture a shelf with many boxes, each one holding its own unanswered question, each one quietly asking to be read again. Cold case work has a particular rhythm. It is not like the first days of an inquiry, when the phone rings often and information arrives in uneven waves. It is slower than that. A detective returns to the old statements, compares names, checks whether someone once dismissed now looks different in light of new knowledge. The work has the sound of pages turning, keyboards tapping, rain touching the windows after dark. You sit beside that detective tonight. You read what they read. You notice how old statements carry the shape of their time, how people described streets, clothes, and movements in the language they had then. Some details remain sharp, others soften. Memory changes, but paper holds its first version. That can be a comfort, and sometimes it can be a problem. We have to be gentle with both. For years, the Glasgow case waited while science moved forward. DNA profiling became stronger, more sensitive, and more able to work with old or limited material. Laboratories learned to read smaller traces. Courts learned how to hear that evidence. Investigators learned that boxes once thought exhausted might still contain something useful. It was not magic. It was method, training, validation, and patience. There is a kind of humility in reopening an old case. You begin by admitting that the first inquiry did not have everything it needed, not because those officers did not care, and not because the family's pain was invisible, but because time had not yet given them certain tools. You look back without contempt. You look forward without arrogance. The file asks for both. When the cigarette end was examined again with newer methods, it began to offer what it could not offer before. A DNA profile was recovered. You can imagine the laboratory without making it dramatic. White benches, gloved hands, labeled tubes, the low hush of machines doing precise work through the night. There is no raised voice in that room. There is only care, measurement, and the quiet hope that a trace might hold. That profile was compared, as profiles are, against known records. The name that emerged was Graham McGill. He had been a convicted offender, and the significance of the match brought the old Glasgow case into motion again. You do not need the moment to be loud. In real cold case work, even a major result is followed by checking, corroborating, documenting, and asking what the evidence truly proves. One result opens a door. It does not finish the walk. Years later, something shifted in the file, and the old paper began to meet the newer science. You turn to the review phase now, where the Glasgow case becomes a story of patient reconstruction rather than sudden discovery. Investigators did not only take the DNA result and stop there. They returned to the old materials. They reviewed the timeline. They looked at Mary McLaughlin's movements, at who might have been nearby, at what could be confirmed from 1984, and what had to be treated with caution. This is where patience matters most. The room feels cooler in this part of the story. You can imagine an archive table, a cardboard box opened under pale light, the faint rasp of a folder being drawn free. There may be dust at the edges. There may be old staples leaving rust marks on witness statements. The photographs have that muted finish of another era, slightly yellowed, their corners trying to curl. You handle them carefully because they have already carried enough. Cold case detectives often work between two kinds of time. There is the time of the original event, where every minute matters, and there is the time of the review, where years have passed and every surviving detail must be protected. Witnesses may have moved, some may have died, memories may have faded, but documents remain, exhibits remain, if they were kept well. Science can return to them with new questions. In Mary's case, the cigarette end was not the only matter considered. Further forensic work connected McGill to material associated with Mary's clothing and the cord involved in the case. We keep the wording plain and careful here, because the dignity of the person at the center matters more than any detail. The point is not the violence. The point is the evidence, preserved across decades, finally able to speak in a language the court could hear. You can feel how slow that process must have been. Nothing in a cold case moves, only because someone wishes it would. A sample must be tested. A result must be checked. A report must be written. Disclosure must be prepared. Officers must trace records, interview people, and build the kind of case that can stand in daylight after many dark years. It is quiet work, but it is demanding. Graham McGill was arrested decades after Mary McLaughlin died. By then, Glasgow had changed around the old file. Streets had new shop fronts. People carried phones in their pockets. Police systems looked different, yet the question in the folder was the same. Who was responsible for Mary's death, and could that responsibility now be proved with care? You sit with that question, not as a riddle, but as a duty. The family had waited through years when nothing seemed to happen. That kind of waiting has its own weather. Birthdays pass. Children grow older. Houses change hands. News arrives about other cases, other breakthroughs, and you wonder whether your own file will ever stir. For families, Cold case work can feel both hopeful and painful, because hope asks them to turn back toward what hurt them. We should remember that as we go, the investigators who reopened the Glasgow case had to work with what remained. They could not create fresh memories from old witnesses. They could not return the city to 1984, but they could listen to the evidence that had survived. They could place the DNA results beside the original investigation. They could ask whether the old paper and new science pointed in the same direction. That is the patient shape of justice in a case like this. When you read a cold case file, you begin to notice how many people are involved in preserving truth. The first officer who labels a cigarette end, the property clerk who logs it, the scientist who tests it decades later, the detective who reads the old statement again, the family member who keeps asking. No one person carries the whole answer. It passes from hand to hand like a small lamp kept lit through a long corridor. And as the Glasgow case moved toward court, the file had to become something more formal, more exact, and more carefully arranged than memory alone could ever be. In the court stage of the Glasgow case, patience changed its form. It became evidence-led in order, questions asked in measured tones, dates placed before a jury, and scientific findings explained carefully enough for ordinary people to weigh them. You can imagine the atmosphere there: polished wood, shuffled papers, low voices, the dry scent of old walls and winter coats. A courtroom has its own hush. It asks everyone to slow down. Mary McLaughlin's name was spoken there not as an abstraction, but as the person at the center of the case. That matters. In long investigations, names can become labels, and labels can become shorthand. But in the better kind of telling, we bring the person back into view. Mary was a mother. She had a family. She had a life before the file, and the file existed because that life deserved an answer. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence that had emerged from the preserved items. The cigarette end mattered. The DNA profile mattered. The additional findings mattered. The defense tested what could be tested, as the process requires. You and I can sit with that calmly, because a solved case must be more than a belief. It must be examined. It must be shown. It must pass through questions and still hold. There is something deeply human about old evidence entering a modern courtroom. An item collected under one era's rules is carried into another era's understanding. The paper trail becomes important. The storage becomes important. The handling becomes important. A small object is no longer just a small object. It becomes a line through time, and every person who touched the line must be accounted for. You turn another page, and the language becomes more precise. DNA likelihoods, exhibit numbers, forensic reports, dates of testing, names of analysts. None of it sounds like the soft grief of the family, and yet it exists in service of that grief. Technical language can feel cold, but sometimes it is the path by which care becomes proof. That is worth holding gently. Graham McGill denied responsibility, but the jury heard the evidence and convicted him. The sentence came many years after Mary died, and the years themselves could not be restored. No verdict can return the lost time. Still, the case had moved from unanswered to answered in the only way the legal system can offer, through evidence, process, and a finding made in open court. You let that settle without making it louder than it is. For Mary's family, the conviction marked an end to one kind of waiting. Not every kind. Families often say that justice helps, but it doesn't erase absence. We can understand that without needing to explain it too much. Some silences remain even after a verdict. Some chairs stay empty. Some questions soften, but do not vanish. The file can close in law, while the human story keeps breathing quietly around it. And after the verdict, the Glasgow case still had one more lesson to leave behind. Not about fear, but about the long memory of careful work. You return to the first exhibit list, because that is where the lesson begins. in the plain habits of people who did not know they were preserving the future. The page is not romantic. It is typed, practical, and a little stiff, with margins that feel wider than modern paper somehow does. Yet, when you read it slowly, you can sense the care beneath it. Someone stood in Mary McLaughlin's flat in Glasgow and decided that small things should not be thrown away, and that decision waited quietly for years. We should pause with that, because cold case work often depends on such ordinary acts. You can picture a constable's pen moving across a label, the ink slightly shiny before it dries, while the room still holds the faint smell of cigarettes, dust, and autumn rain carried in on shoes. Nothing about that moment would have felt historic. There was no way to know that a future laboratory, using methods not yet part of routine police life, might one day return to that same little object and find something clear inside it. The Glasgow case asks us to notice how patience can be built into systems. It lives in evidence rooms, in seals that hold, in forms that are filled out correctly, and in clerks who understand that a box may matter long after the people who packed it have moved on. You sit beside the shelf now, in your mind, and you see how quiet it is. The air is cool, the cardboard has softened at the edges, the labels carry dates from another life, and still the files remain reachable. When we think of a case being solved after 32 years, or after more than 3 decades of waiting, we often imagine a single moment when everything changes. But you and I know, as we sit with the file, that change usually arrives in layers. First, someone chooses to reopen a box. Then someone reads the old statements. Then someone checks what science can now do. Then the material is sent away, and the waiting begins again, quieter this time, more disciplined, but still full of human hope. There is a particular sound to old paperwork being handled with care. It is softer than new paper, almost cloth-like in places, with a tiny rasp when one page slides over another. You hear it as you turn to the statements taken in 1984. Each statement is a little room of memory. A person speaks from that year, describing an evening, a face, a habit, a conversation half remembered in the days after Mary died. They could not know who would read their words decades later. You sit with those witnesses gently, because memory is not a machine. Some people would have been certain about a time, and wrong about a detail. Others may have doubted themselves, and still given something valuable. A neighbor might remember footsteps, a publican might remember a face, a family member might remember Mary's plans, a mood, the way an ordinary evening was meant to unfold. In a cold case review, you do not treat those voices as decoration. You listen for their edges, and for where they meet the evidence. The investigators who came back to the Glasgow case had to read those old voices in a newer room. The lights may have been brighter, the desks may have held computers instead of heavy typewriters, but the work was still close and patient. You can imagine someone leaning over a photocopy, comparing one line with another, making notes in a neat hand. The smell might be toner now, not carbon paper, yet the feeling is the same. One careful question placed beside another, and we follow that feeling because it keeps the story human. Mary McLaughlin was not an exhibit number, though exhibits helped answer what happened to her. She was a woman with children, routines, preferences, and a place in the lives of others. You let that remain near the front of the file. Every time the science becomes technical, we bring the person back into the room, not loudly, but steadily, as a way of keeping the investigation honest. For many years, forensic evidence was waiting for forensic language to catch up. That is a strange thought, but it is true in many cold cases. The material existed. What was missing was the method fine enough to read it. So the Glasgow case rested in that long in-between, where an answer may be present but unavailable, like writing under a sealed envelope. You can hold the envelope, turn it in your hand, and still not read what is inside. Then science changed its tools. DNA profiling grew more sensitive, more established and more accepted in court. What had once required larger, fresher samples could sometimes be attempted with older, smaller traces. Laboratories developed routines for avoiding contamination, for interpreting mixed or limited profiles, and for explaining results in a way that could be tested. None of this was hurried. It came through years of research, training, errors studied carefully, and standards tightened until the work could carry the weight placed upon it. You can picture the laboratory as an unusually calm place for such heavy questions. There are benches wiped clean, racks of tubes, sealed bags, printed labels, and the low mechanical sound of machines running through the night. A scientist does not need to know Mary's full story to treat the sample with care. In fact, the discipline of the work requires a certain steadiness. The sample must be handled as itself. The result must be allowed to say only what it can say. When a DNA profile was obtained from the cigarette end, the old Glasgow file gained a new kind of voice. Not a complete story by itself, but a voice all the same. You and I can sit quietly with the difference. A profile does not explain intention. It does not describe an evening. It does not restore all the lost years. But it can place a person where they had not been placed before, and in a case long held open by uncertainty, that can be important. The name Graham McGill entered the renewed inquiry through that forensic route. From there, investigators had to do the slower work again. They had to ask whether the match fit the broader case, whether other evidence supported it, whether explanations had been given or could be tested, and whether the old materials had been preserved in a way the court could trust. You see how the work folds back on itself. A breakthrough leads back to paperwork. Science leads back to patience. This is where the Glasgow case becomes less about a single trace and more about the whole chain of care. You read the chain of custody as if it were a quiet map. Who recovered the item? Who sealed it? Where it was stored? When it was moved? Who opened it for testing? Each step matters because each step protects the meaning of the final result. Without that chain, even a strong finding can begin to loosen. With it, an old object can speak across decades. There is a kind of calm rigor in that, and it is worth noticing. We often talk about cold cases as if they are solved by luck, but luck needs a place to land. If the evidence had been discarded, if the labels had failed, if the storage had been careless, the later science might have had nothing to work with. So when you sit with the Glasgow case tonight, you are also sitting with the many unnamed people who kept the file from vanishing. You turn another page, and now the review widens. There are not only exhibits, but histories. Graham McGill's background could be examined, his whereabouts, his possible connection to Mary, and his relationship to the area could be considered against what was known. Old convictions and old records may have had to be gathered, but every piece still needed relevance. In patient detective work, the old temptation is to let suspicion run ahead of proof. The good investigator keeps both hands on the table. That image helps us move slowly. You have the folder open, your coffee gone lukewarm, the room quiet except for the murmur of distant traffic. Outside, Glasgow might be wet again, pavements shining under streetlights, buses breathing at stops, people stepping around puddles without thinking about the old case at all. Inside the file, however, 1984 remains present. The city has changed, but the page has not. You keep reading. Cold case detectives often speak of refamiliarizing themselves with a case, and that phrase has a gentle accuracy. They do not simply read it once, they move into it for a while. They learn its rooms, its recurring names, its uncertain times, its blank spaces. You can feel that happening now as we spend longer with Mary McLaughlin's file. The names begin to settle. The shape of the inquiry becomes familiar. The unanswered question sits in the same place each time you return. In the renewed Glasgow investigation, the forensic evidence was especially significant because it gave investigators something the original inquiry could not have given them. It linked McGill to items in a way that could be presented and examined. Yet the human work remained necessary. Officers still had to speak with people, find records, prepare reports, and make sure that the case built around the science did not ask the science to say more than it could. That restraint is part of the justice. You can hear the restraint in the best kind of courtroom explanation. A scientist does not say, "This means everything." A scientist says what was tested, what was found, and how likely the finding is under different propositions. It can sound dry, even distant, but that dryness is protective. It keeps emotion from bending the result. In a case with decades of grief behind it, that measured tone can feel almost austere, but it is one way the truth is guarded. For the family, meanwhile, the revived inquiry would have brought old pain into present rooms. You can imagine a phone call, perhaps expected and feared at the same time, telling them there had been movement. The receiver feels warm in the hand. The house is suddenly too quiet. News like that does not arrive neatly. It stirs hope, memory, anger, relief, and caution all at once. We hold that gently, because families are never just waiting for facts. They are waiting with their whole lives. When investigators came to tell them more, the language would likely have been careful. Cold case officers learn that hope must be handled responsibly. A development is not yet a conviction. A match is not yet a verdict. A charge is not yet the end. You can sit in that room with them for a moment, without intruding, and sense the weight of each cautious sentence. After so many years, even measured words can echo. The Glasgow case also reminds us that justice can be late without being meaningless. That is not a tidy comfort, and we should not make it one. Mary's family lost years in which the answer did not come. Detectives who worked the first investigation may have carried frustration for the rest of their careers. Witnesses aged, the city moved on. But when the file reopened, the passage of time did not make Mary less worthy of care. If anything, it made the care feel more deliberate. You turn again to the old city. Glasgow in the 1980s had its own sounds and surfaces, and every investigation is shaped by the world around it. There were public telephones, paper records, local routines, and face-to-face conversations that had to be written down later. CCTV was not the broad net it would become in later decades. Digital trails did not follow people through their evenings. A detective had to build movement from memory, observation, and persistence. That older world made some things harder and some things different. People knew their streets more directly, but records could be sparse. A witness might remember a regular visitor, but not a full name. A time might be given by the closing of a pub or the arrival of a bus, rather than by a phone log. When we read the file now, we have to read it in its own weather. You cannot demand from 1984 the conveniences of a later age. So the original inquiry did what it could. It gathered statements, searched for connections, and preserved material. It asked questions in a city of stairwells, corner shops, social clubs, and evening rain. It carried Mary's name through interview after interview. You can almost hear the repeated courtesy of officers at doors, the pause after a question, the scratch of a pen as someone tries to remember whether it was Thursday or Friday, whether the coat was dark or simply looked dark in the light. And then, as happens in unsolved cases, momentum slowed. It does not always stop all at once. It becomes quieter. The calls become fewer. New cases arrive. Officers are reassigned. The file remains, but the daily motion around it thins. This can feel painful to imagine, but it is part of the truth. Police work is made of finite hours, and cold cases often enter a long season where the most important thing is that they are not lost. The Glasgow case was not lost. That sentence can rest here for a moment. It was not answered for many years, but it was not answered for many years, but it was not lost. Exhibits stayed where they could be found. Records survived. The family's need for an answer did not expire. Later investigators could return to what had been gathered. And that return was possible only because the earlier work still existed. You and I keep that distinction close because it matters. When we think about Mary's case as bedtime narration, we are not trying to make it smaller than it was. We are trying to hold it without sharp edges. That is different. We let the facts remain factual, but we do not lean into fear. We lean into patience and into the people who kept looking. The file under your hand is not a source of alarm tonight. It is a record of endurance, paper by paper, seal by seal, name by name. The renewed investigation would also have required legal patience. A cold case charge must be prepared with special care, because old memories can be challenged and old procedures examined closely. The passage of time gives defense lawyers real questions to ask. Were the exhibits secure? Were the records complete? Could witnesses still speak reliably? Did the forensic findings support the inference being made? None of those questions are obstacles to justice. They are part of making justice trustworthy. You sit with that idea in the stillness of the room. It is easy, from far away, to wish for speed. But speed is not the highest value in an old case. Care is. Accuracy is. The right result must be reached in a way that can be defended, because if the process fails, the family may be asked to endure pain again. So the file moves slowly toward court, and every slow movement has a purpose. In the court papers, the language becomes formal. Mary McLaughlin is named. Graham McGill is named. Dates are set out. Exhibits are numbered. Findings are described. A life and a death become arranged into admissible form. You can feel the distance between that legal structure and the living grief beneath it. Yet the structure is necessary. It gives the evidence a place to stand. It asks the jury to look carefully, not hurriedly, and to decide what has been proved. A jury hearing an old case is asked to do something difficult. They must travel back through evidence, but not through imagination. They must listen to witnesses, scientists, and lawyers, while remembering that sympathy alone cannot decide anything. You can picture them with notebooks, water glasses, tired eyes, and the responsibility of attention. The courtroom may be quiet, but attention itself can be heavy. In an old case, every listener carries some part of the delay. For Mary's family, each court day would have reopened the file in public. Details that had lived in police rooms and private grief were spoken aloud. That can be both necessary and exhausting. You can imagine the wooden benches, the shuffle of coats, the slight echo of footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone may hold a tissue folded in one hand. Someone else may stare at the floor. There are no easy rooms in a case like this. Still, the courtroom is where the years of preservation finally meet decision. The cigarette end, once a small item in a Glasgow flat, becomes evidence through testimony. The DNA profile is explained. The connection to McGill is examined. The old investigation is brought forward, not as a memory only, but as a structured account. You and I follow it calmly, because the shape of the process matters as much as the outcome. It is how a file becomes an answer. The conviction did not arrive from nowhere. It came from the long accumulation of kept things and careful readings. That is the part worth staying with tonight. We do not need to sharpen it into a dramatic turn. The deeper truth is quieter. A case can wait for decades, and still a cigarette end, a label, a laboratory report, and a detective's renewed attention can meet at last in the same place. After conviction, there are usually public statements, but we can imagine them softly. Family members may speak of relief, of grief, of years that cannot be returned. Police may acknowledge the original inquiry, the cold case team, and the forensic specialists. Those words are important, though they never contain all of what has been lived. A statement is a small vessel. It can carry gratitude and sorrow, but not the whole sea. You look back across the file now, not to close it, but to understand its rhythm. Mary's life, the night in Glasgow, the first investigation, the preserved evidence, the long quiet. the forensic review, the name that emerged, the renewed work, the court. Each stage has its own texture, and each texture asks you to slow down. If you rush, the case becomes a headline. If you stay with it, it becomes human again. That is why the Glasgow case belongs in the world of patient detective work. It shows how the past is not always finished with us. Sometimes the past is sealed in a bag, placed in a box, and kept under conditions careful enough for the future to ask one more question. You can hear the air in the archive again, cool and still. You can smell the dust and cardboard. You can feel the weight of the box as it comes down from the shelf. The box is never only a box, it is a promise made imperfectly, by one era to another. The first investigators could not promise a solution, but they could promise preservation. The later investigators could not promise certainty at the first review, but they could promise attention. The scientists could not promise a result, but they could promise method. Each promise was limited. Together, they became strong enough to matter. As you sit with this part of the file, you may notice how much of cold case work depends on humility. The detective must accept that someone before them may have missed something, and also that those earlier officers may have done their best. The scientist must accept that a trace can be fragile. The family must endure updates that may not become answers. The court must weigh old evidence in present time. No one gets to stand outside the years. The Glasgow case took place across changing generations of policing. In 1984, many records were physical, many searches were manual, and many links depended on local knowledge. By the time the case was solved, investigators could use forensic databases, modern laboratory systems, and more developed procedures for reviewing unsolved cases. You can feel the difference between those worlds. One smells of paper, cigarette smoke, and damp wool. The other smells of toner, plastic folders, and clean lab gloves. But the heart of the work did not change as much as the tools did. Someone still had to ask, what do we know? Someone still had to ask, how do we know it? Someone still had to ask, what remains uncertain? Those are the questions you ask too, sitting at the desk under the small lamp. They are not dramatic questions. They are patient ones. They keep the mind steady, and they keep the file from becoming only a story. Mary's case also reminds us that evidence can have different meanings at different times. In the first inquiry, the cigarette end may have been one item among many. In the later inquiry, it became a key to a biological profile. In court, it became part of a larger argument about presence, contact, and responsibility. The object did not change. The knowledge around it changed. That is one of the quiet wonders of cold case work, and also one of its cautions. You can hold an object for years and still not understand all it might someday offer. That thought applies beyond investigations. People keep letters, photographs, receipts, little things in drawers, not always knowing why they matter. Later, a date on the back of a picture may explain a memory. A name in a margin may reconnect a family. In the Glasgow case, the kept object carried forensic meaning, but the human pattern feels familiar. Sometimes what we save becomes legible only later. There is tenderness in that idea. If we let it stay modest, it does not undo what happened. It does not make the waiting easy, but it says something about care lasting beyond its first moment. The officer who sealed the exhibit did not know the future, yet the act reached the future. The family who kept asking did not know when the answer would come, yet their asking kept Mary present. The cold case team did not create the evidence, yet they listened when it could finally speak. The city around Mary's case has its own part in the atmosphere. Glasgow is not a single mood. It has wide roads, narrow closes, warm kitchens, wet pavements, noisy buses, and quiet rooms where people remember. In the file, the city appears through addresses and movements, but you can sense more than that. You can feel the damp cold against windows. You can hear voices carrying along a stair. You can smell rain on stone and chip shop vinegar drifting through an evening. You are not walking those streets to seek fear. You are walking them to understand scale. A city can hold thousands of lives at once, each one vivid to itself and invisible to most others. Mary's life was vivid to the people who loved her. To the investigation, it had to be reconstructed from traces, words, and recollections. That difference is painful, but it is also why the work matters. The file tries, however imperfectly, to make a life visible where harm once tried to reduce it. When the renewed inquiry began to move, it had to bring together those two forms of visibility. The forensic profile made one thing visible. The family's memory made another. The old witness statements made another. The court process required them to be arranged carefully, without forcing them into shapes they could not hold. You can imagine the detective's desk late in the afternoon, with folders in careful stacks, a highlighter uncapped, and a cup of tea cooling near the edge. The work is not glamorous. That is one reason it can be reassuring to follow at night. It is made of reading, checking, calling, logging, waiting, asking again, and making sure the answer is not being rushed. The Glasgow case did not need spectacle to be meaningful. It needed time, science, and attention. It needed people willing to sit with old pain without turning away. You and I sit there now in the same spirit, slow and quiet. There may have been moments in the review when progress felt small, a document found, a date confirmed, a former witness traced, a forensic request approved. Each step might have seemed modest on its own, but cold casework often advances by modest steps that only later reveal their alignment. You can think of them as low lights along a corridor, not bright enough to dazzle, but enough to keep someone walking in the right direction. The years themselves have to be handled carefully in a story like this. 32 years, more than 3 decades. The exact count depends on which moment you choose as the point when the file truly began to shift. There was the year Mary died. There were later reviews. There were forensic developments. There was the arrest. There was the conviction. Each date carries a different kind of meaning. We let the timeline breathe, because real cases rarely fit perfectly into a neat phrase. What matters for our purposes tonight is the long delay and the patient resolution. The Glasgow case stayed unanswered through many ordinary seasons. Winters came and went. New officers joined the force. Children in the family became adults. Scientific methods developed quietly in the background of public life. Then, at last, the old material met the new technique, and the file moved again. That movement is the center of the story, not the speed of it. You can sense how the family might have measured the years differently from the police. For investigators, a case may be reviewed at intervals, placed into systems, assessed for forensic opportunity, and reopened when a path appears. For a family, the case is present in anniversaries, conversations, and quiet, private moments when something ordinary brings the person back to mind. Both kinds of time are real. In Mary's case, those two clocks eventually met in the renewed inquiry. The word closure is often used after convictions, but we should be careful with it. You and I can avoid making that word do too much. A verdict can answer legal questions. It can name responsibility. It can validate years of waiting. But it does not close love, memory, or grief. It does not return the ordinary conversations that were lost. So when the Glasgow case was solved, the answer came with relief, and still with all the tenderness of what could not be restored. In the quiet of this narration, we can honor both truths. The case was solved in law, and the loss remained real. The evidence did its work, and the years were still gone. The family received an answer, and Mary was still missed. Holding those truths together is part of patient compassion. We do not force comfort where it does not belong. We let the comfort be modest, and therefore honest. You return again to the detectives because their patience forms the spine of this telling. Some may have inherited the file from people they never met. Some may have read statements taken before they joined the service. Some may have felt that peculiar responsibility of asking a family to trust the process one more time. Their work did not begin in a fresh scene. It began in the middle of a long silence, with a file that had already disappointed many people by remaining unanswered. That is difficult work. It requires emotional steadiness as well as technical care. A cold case officer must be hopeful enough to look again, but cautious enough not to promise too much. They must be respectful toward earlier investigators, but willing to question earlier assumptions. They must use new methods without worshipping them. They must speak to families as people, not as case contacts. In the Glasgow case, that balance helped carry the file toward proof. You can imagine one of those officers reading late, perhaps after the office has thinned and the phones have grown quiet. The desk lamp makes a small circle over the page. Outside the window, evening settles against the glass. Inside the file, a witness from 1984 is still speaking. The officer reads the words once, then again, and marks a line that may matter. This is not a dramatic picture, it is a truthful one, and it has its own gravity. The scientist's patience is different, but just as real. Laboratory work asks for repetition, control, and restraint. Samples must be tracked. Results must be interpreted according to standards. Contamination must be guarded against. Reports must be written in language that can survive scrutiny. You can hear the printer in the lab, the soft snap of gloves being removed, the small click of a tube being placed into a rack. These ordinary sounds belong to the long answer too. Then there is the patience of the court. Trials move according to their own rhythm, and an old case can require jurors to listen through technical evidence and historical context with care. There may be delays, legal arguments, adjournments, and procedural matters that never appear in simplified retellings. But they matter. A verdict is strongest when the path to it is clear. You and I can let that slow machinery remain part of the story, because justice is not only a result, it is also a method. In Mary McLaughlin's case, the method finally held. The evidence was heard. The jury convicted Graham McGill. The old uncertainty gave way to legal responsibility for the people who had carried Mary's memory through the unanswered years. That finding mattered deeply. We say it gently, because there is no need to raise the volume. Some truths arrive with enough weight on their own. They do not need to be decorated. Afterward, the Glasgow case could be understood differently. It was no longer simply a cold case. It became an example of what preserved evidence and renewed science can do. Police forces often look to such cases when deciding which old files might benefit from modern review. Families of other victims may hear about a conviction and wonder whether their own unanswered case might one day move. That hope must be handled carefully, but it is not unreasonable. It is part of why these stories continue to matter. You sit with the broader pattern now, still keeping Mary at the center. Across many places, cold case units have reopened files once thought beyond reach. Old clothing, stamps, envelopes, bindings, cigarette ends, and fingernail samples have been examined again. Some yielded answers, some did not. The process is uneven, expensive, and delicate. Yet each attempt says that time alone does not decide the value of a case. The passage of years is a difficulty, not a verdict. The Glasgow case sits within that wider history, but it remains itself. We should not let it become merely an example. Mary McLaughlin's name belongs to her own story. Her family's waiting was their own. The flat in Glasgow, the evidence gathered there, the long storage, the later testing, and the conviction all belong to this particular file. You can feel the folder under your hand again, specific and worn, with its own old smell of paper and rain. A listener drifting in and out of sleep might hear only pieces now. Glasgow, Mary, the cigarette end, the long wait, the lab, the court. That is enough. The story does not demand wakefulness. It moves like an old case being read in a quiet room, where even partial attention can rest on the steadiness of the voice. If your eyes are heavy, the file will still be here. We are not hurrying ahead of you, and in that slow return, we can spend a little more time with the idea of evidence as memory. Human memory fades, but physical evidence can hold certain facts without knowing them. A cigarette end does not remember, a fiber does not remember, a sealed item does not grieve or hope. Yet, under careful methods, it can preserve contact, presence, or connection. It becomes a different kind of witness, one that waits without language until someone learns how to ask. That kind of witness must be treated with humility. It can be powerful, but it is not alive. It cannot explain context. It cannot answer every question. Investigators must place it beside other facts, not above them like an oracle. In the Glasgow case, the forensic findings mattered because they fit within an inquiry that could be presented and examined. You and I keep returning to that balance, because it is the difference between patience and assumption. Assumption is quick, patience is slower. Assumption fills gaps with whatever seems likely. Patience marks the gap and keeps looking. In a bedtime retelling, we are especially drawn to patience because it has a softer rhythm and a kinder discipline. It lets silence remain silence until evidence speaks. It does not force the file into a shape just to feel finished. The Glasgow case needed that discipline across many years. You can picture the file at different ages. In the first months, it is active, handled often, its pages still crisp. After a few years, it is heavier, less frequently opened, but not forgotten. After decades, it has become an archive object. Its paper changed by time, its relevance waiting for rediscovery. Then, in the review, it becomes active again. New notes are added to old ones. New reports sit beside older statements. The file grows another layer. That layering is one of the most moving parts of old investigations. A young officer's handwriting from 1984 may sit near a modern forensic report printed decades later. A witness's first words may be read by someone born after the case began. The past and present do not merge exactly, but they share the same folder. You can feel the thickness of it in your hands, not only as paper, but as time made physical. When the case entered court, those layers had to be translated for people who had not lived with them. The jury could not be expected to feel the full history of the file. They had to hear it in order, through evidence. That is why the prosecution's task was patient too. It had to guide without overstating, explain without confusing, and show why the preserved traces mattered. The defense, in turn, had the right to test that account. This testing is part of the truth-seeking. We can imagine the jurors going home each evening with the case still in their thoughts. They may have noticed the grey weather outside, the ordinary buses, the shop windows, the same kind of city life that had gone on around Mary's case for years. A trial does not stop the world. It takes place inside it. That contrast can be strangely quieting. While evidence is being weighed in one room, people elsewhere are buying bread, catching trains, and closing curtains against the dark. For Mary's family, ordinary life must have carried the case all along. That is one of the details we can feel without inventing specifics. Grief does not stay in official spaces. It goes into kitchens, birthdays, hospital waiting rooms, weddings, and quiet walks home. It is present when someone says a name and when no one says it. The solved Glasgow case did not begin in court, and it did not live only in police records. It lived in people. You keep the lamp low as we continue, because there is no need to brighten the room. The file is readable enough. The paper glows softly at the edges. Somewhere in the imagined building, a heating pipe knocks once and settles. These small sounds help us stay with the work without turning it harsh. We are looking at a serious case, but we are looking in a careful way, with respect for sleep and for the people whose lives the case touched. The old detectives who first worked Mary's case may never have imagined how DNA would later transform investigations. In 1984, the future was not obvious. Forensic science was developing, but the idea that a tiny biological trace could decades later identify a suspect through a database would have sounded extraordinary to many officers on the ground. They worked with shoe leather, interviews, instincts, records, and what laboratory methods were available. Their preservation of evidence became the bridge. A bridge is a useful image here, if we keep it quiet. On one side is the original Glasgow investigation, with its paper notes and immediate search for answers. On the other side is the later review, with modern testing and renewed legal action. Between them lies storage, procedure, and the stubborn refusal to throw away what might matter. You walk across that bridge slowly with the file in your hands, feeling the boards hold under each step. In some cases, old evidence cannot be used. It may be degraded, contaminated, missing, or collected under conditions that make interpretation too uncertain. That reality makes Mary's case more striking. The evidence survived well enough to be tested. The test produced meaningful results. The results contributed to a prosecution. Each of those steps could have failed. We do not need to make that dramatic. We can simply notice how many quiet doors had to remain open. And behind each door was work. Someone had to decide the case deserved review. Someone had to locate the exhibits. Someone had to authorize testing. Someone had to interpret reports. Someone had to trace McGill. Someone had to prepare statements and assemble the prosecution file. It is tempting to say the case was solved by DNA, but that is only partly true. DNA gave the case a voice. People still had to listen properly. That distinction matters because technology does not care by itself. Machines can process samples, databases can compare profiles, and software can assist interpretation. But care enters through human choices. A case is reviewed because someone chooses to review it. A family is updated because someone chooses to communicate. An old exhibit is handled gently because someone understands its value. In the Glasgow case, science and care met, and the answer became possible. You turn toward the image of the archive again, because it is restful and true. Shelves rise in dim rows. Boxes sit with labels facing outward. Some contain files that were solved long ago. Some contain matters still open. Some may never yield more than they already have. The room does not know the difference. It holds them all with the same stillness. The detective must bring the questions. The file can only wait. Mary's file waited through a changing Scotland, through changes in policing, law, forensic practice, and public awareness. What did not change was the fact that a woman had died and her family needed an answer. That simple fact remained beneath every later development. You can write it on the inside cover of the file, not as a slogan, but as a compass. The person comes first. The method serves the person. This is why we return to Mary's name often. In a case with forensic detail, it is easy for the technical thread to dominate. But each time we say Mary McLoughlin, we restore the human center of the Glasgow case. We remember that the evidence was gathered from her home, that the inquiry existed because of her life, and that the conviction mattered because someone real had been taken from the people who loved her. The court's finding against Graham McGill gave the old evidence its final legal shape. Yet even after a verdict, investigators may revisit their own work, not to change the outcome, but to learn from the path. What preserved evidence proved most important? What review processes helped? What delays occurred? What communication with family could be improved? Cold case work is never only backward-looking. Each solved case teaches the next review where to look more carefully. You and I can imagine a detective placing Mary's file back on a desk after the conviction. not with triumph, but with a long exhale. The room is the same. The chairs are the same. The clock moves with its ordinary patience. Yet the file has changed. It no longer asks the same question in quite the same way. It now carries an answer, and the answer carries all the years it took to arrive. Still, even an answered file has quiet edges. There may be details the court did not need to settle. There may be moments only Mary knew. There may be family questions that no verdict could fully satisfy. That is not a failure of the investigation. It is part of the human limit of all old cases. Legal truth can be strong and still not total. We let that thought rest softly because it keeps the story honest. The Glasgow case was at last solved through the meeting of preservation and progress. That phrase sounds simple, but you know by now how much is held inside it. Preservation means careful hands in 1984. Progress means decades of scientific development. The meeting means someone recognized the old exhibit's new potential and followed the process through. Nothing about that is sudden, even if the result can look sudden from the outside. If you were the detective tonight, sitting with this file for the first time, you might make a note in the margin. Do not underestimate small items. It is a practical note, but it feels almost philosophical. Small items survive. Small decisions matter. Small acts of care may outlast the person who made them. In Mary McLaughlin's case, a cigarette end became one of those small things with a long reach. You might make another note too. Do not confuse quiet with absence. For many years, the Glasgow case may have seemed quiet to the public. There were no daily headlines, no visible movement, no fresh appeal every week. But quiet did not mean the question was gone. Quiet can be the state of a file waiting for the right method, or a family carrying memory privately, or a detective returning to the evidence when the time is right. That is a comforting distinction for a sleep story, though it comes from a serious place. Not everything important is noisy. Some of the most consequential work happens under fluorescent lights in small offices, in laboratories after hours, in archive rooms where the air feels a little cold, and in courtrooms where people speak in measured voices. The Glasgow case moved through all of those places. Its answer grew slowly in rooms like that. You notice now how often patience appears as a physical sensation, the weight of the folder, the coolness of the archive, the dry touch of old paper, the plastic smoothness of an evidence bag, the faint tackiness of a label, the quiet click of a pen. These are not decorative details. They are the body of the work. Investigations are made by people with hands, eyes, tired shoulders, and attention that must be renewed each day. Mary's family had their own physical memories too, though we do not presume to know them closely. Perhaps a photograph handled many times. Perhaps a chair at a table. Perhaps a street passed with a quickening of thought. Families do not experience cases as timelines alone. They experience them as objects, rooms, anniversaries, and sudden returns of feeling. When the case moved again, all those private memories would have moved with it. The long delay also raises another quiet point. Justice systems must be built to remember beyond the span of public attention. A case may disappear from newspapers, but it must not disappear from responsibility. Cold case units exist because memory needs structure. Evidence rooms exist because memory needs storage. Review procedures exist because memory needs occasions to wake. The Glasgow case shows what can happen when those structures endure. Of course, not every case can be solved this way. We should say that gently. Even here, in the middle of the story, some evidence does not survive. Some leads fade beyond recovery. Some answers remain out of reach, despite devoted work. But Mary's case shows that impossibility should not be assumed too early. An old file can still contain a future question. A sealed item can still matter. A family's long wait can still meet an answer. You turn the page again, and the paper catches slightly near the staple. It is a small sensation, but it brings you back into the room. The case is not an idea floating above us. It is a file, a city, a family, a laboratory, a courtroom, and years of methodical work. It is also a reminder that the past can be approached gently, without turning away from its seriousness. That is our way through it tonight. As the imagined night deepens, the Glasgow streets outside the file grow quieter. Taxis pass with wet tires whispering on the road. A late bus lights the pavement blue-white for a moment, then moves on. In the archive, the shelves do not change. In the laboratory, machines complete their cycles. In the courtroom memory, the papers settle after being handled. These images can drift together without urgency, each one part of the long path from uncertainty to proof. You stay with Mary McLaughlin's name as the anchor. Whenever the forensic detail becomes intricate, whenever the timeline stretches, whenever the legal process feels formal, her name returns us to the center. Mary was the reason the evidence was kept. Mary was the reason the file was reviewed. Mary was the reason the court heard what it heard. In a respectful retelling, that is where the focus remains, calm and constant. The solved Glasgow case also gives us a way to think about responsibility across generations. The original officers could not finish the work, but they could begin it properly. The later officers could not recover the lost years, but they could use the preserved material. The scientists could not speak for Mary, but they could interpret traces with care. The court could not heal the family, but it could decide responsibility. Each generation did what was within its reach. That may be the deepest rhythm of the case. Not one person solving everything, but many people doing one careful part. A label written, a box stored, a sample tested, a statement reread, a family updated, a jury listening. It is a chain, and the chain held. You can hear it almost like a low bell, not loud, but steady, through the years. The file waited, and the work continued when it could. We move next into the slower aftermath of that work, where a solved case still leaves traces in memory, policy, and the quiet thinking of everyone who has ever opened an old file and wondered what might still be waiting inside. The aftermath of the Glasgow case is not a separate room from the investigation, but a quieter corner of the same room, where the papers have been ordered and the voices have lowered. You sit there, with the file still open, and you notice how solved cases do not simply disappear once the verdict is recorded. They remain in policy notes, in training rooms, in the minds of detectives, and in the private memory of families who have carried the unanswered years in ways no document can fully measure. For Mary McLaughlin's family, the answer arrived after such a long passage of time that it must have felt both present and distant. You can imagine the strange weight of hearing responsibility named in court, while also knowing that the years themselves could not be handed back. Relief may sit beside sorrow. Gratitude may sit beside exhaustion. A conviction can bring order to the legal record, but the heart keeps its own archive, and that archive is never arranged quite so neatly. You and I return to the investigator's desk, because it helps us understand the kind of patience that outlives a verdict. The desk is quieter now. The folders are stacked. A pen lies uncapped beside a notepad, where someone has written a final administrative reminder. Outside, Glasgow moves through another ordinary evening, with rain tapping softly on glass and headlights passing in pale ribbons. The case has been answered, yet the work it represents continues in other files, other boxes, other long waits. That is one of the reasons cold case units pay attention to solved cases like this. They study the path, not to repeat it exactly, because every case is different, but to recognize patterns of opportunity. What evidence survived? Which exhibits were suitable for new testing? How the original chain of custody was documented? How the family was kept informed? What legal questions emerged after so many years? You can hear the practical humility in those questions. They are the quiet tools of better future work. The Glasgow case also reminds us that old evidence should be approached with neither despair nor certainty. You do not open a decades-old box assuming it will answer everything, and you do not open it assuming it is useless. You open it with care. You check the seals. You read the labels. You compare logs. You ask what modern methods can safely attempt. Then you wait for the answer, because even the most careful request must pass through time, process, and scientific discipline. In that waiting, the atmosphere changes again. We can imagine the detective, after submitting the evidence for review, returning to other tasks while part of the case sits elsewhere under laboratory conditions. There may be no update for weeks or months. The file remains on a shelf or in a locked cabinet, not forgotten, only paused. That pause has a texture of its own, the quiet frustration of knowing that something important is underway, and the steadiness of not trying to hurry it. When results come back, they must be read slowly. You sit beside the detective as the report is opened. The paper is fresh, cleaner than the old statements, with printed lines and precise terminology. The old case enters a new vocabulary: alleles, profiles, probabilities, comparisons. These words can feel distant from Mary McLaughlin's life, yet they are now part of the path toward naming responsibility. The detective reads them once for meaning, then again for implications, and perhaps a third time for caution. That caution matters because cold case work often sits under the gaze of expectation. Families hope, police services hope, the public may hope when news of a review becomes known. But evidence has to move at its own pace. You and I can feel the discipline of that, the refusal to turn hope into conclusion before the foundation is ready. In the Glasgow case, the later strength came from letting each finding be checked, held, and placed carefully beside the rest. There is another kind of patience in contacting people again after many years. A name from an old statement may lead to a new address, then to a phone call, then to a conversation with someone whose life has changed entirely since 1984. You can imagine the officer's voice being gentle, because the call itself may open a cupboard of old memory. The person on the other end might sit down, look toward a window, and return in thought to a street they have not pictured for years. Some witnesses remember surprisingly well. Others remember feelings more than facts. A smell of damp carpet in a stairwell, a coat color that might have been navy or black, the sound of voices after closing time, the shape of Mary's routine as they understood it then. We do not ask memory to be perfect. We ask it to be honest. In the Glasgow case, as in any cold review, honesty about uncertainty can be as valuable as certainty itself. The investigator writes that down too. Not sure, possibly. Cannot now recall. These phrases can feel disappointing, but they are actually signs of care. A witness who admits uncertainty gives the file a more truthful shape. You can almost see those words in the margin, modest and necessary, preventing the old case from becoming neater than life ever is. Patient detective work respects uncertainty, because respecting uncertainty is one way of respecting truth. Mary's family, of course, would have lived with uncertainty long before the file named it. Their uncertainty was not a note in a margin. It was a daily condition. You can imagine years when no new information came, and still Mary's name remained in family conversations, family photographs, family silence. The absence did not need official recognition to be real. That is why the eventual conviction mattered so much, and why it still could not erase everything that came before. As the case moved toward proof, the old and new parts of the inquiry had to be woven together. You can think of it as careful mending, not with bright thread, but with something plain and strong. The original statements provided context. The preserved exhibits provided opportunity. The DNA results provided connection. The legal process provided a forum where all of it could be examined. The mending did not make the fabric new again, but it made the pattern readable. The Glasgow case sits quietly beside many other cold cases solved through old evidence, but its own details remain particular. A woman in Partick, a flat searched carefully, a cigarette end preserved, a name emerging decades later, a conviction after years of waiting. If you listen to those details at a sleepy pace, they begin to sound less like a headline and more like footsteps along a corridor. Each step is small. Together they carry the file forward. You may notice that the story does not depend on surprise. There is no need for it. The deeper interest is in endurance. The file endured. The evidence endured. The family endured. The question endured. Then the method caught up. That is the shape we follow tonight, and it is a gentle shape despite the seriousness beneath it. It invites the mind not to leap ahead, but to settle into the slow knowledge that some answers arrive only after many careful hands have touched the same problem. We should spend a little time with the evidence room again, because it is one of the quiet, central places in this story. Imagine the fluorescent lights, not bright enough to be harsh, but steady enough to flatten shadows on shelves and labels. The air has a dry, closed smell, with cardboard, plastic, old paper, and maybe the faint metallic note of cabinets. A property officer checks a reference number. A box is lifted down. The past becomes available again. That availability is fragile. Evidence is only useful if it can be located, identified, and trusted. A mislabeled bag can create doubt. A missing seal can raise questions. A storage gap can weaken meaning. So the mundane work of evidence management becomes one of the unsung foundations of justice. In Mary McLaughlin's case, the later result depended on the survival of that foundation. You and I can appreciate that without turning it into ceremony. It is enough to notice the care. The same is true of paperwork. Old forms can feel tedious, especially when they list items and times in plain official language. But in a cold case, those forms become memory supports. They tell later investigators what was found, where it was found, who recovered it, and how it moved. They keep the case from dissolving into hearsay. When you turn those pages slowly, you are not reading bureaucracy only. You are reading the skeleton that lets the later investigation stand. There is also the question of how investigators decide which old cases to review. They may consider the seriousness of the case, the state of preserved evidence, the possibility of modern forensic testing, and whether new information has emerged. You can imagine a meeting room with case files laid out in orderly stacks, each one representing someone's unanswered loss. No one can reopen everything at once. That reality is hard, but it is part of the resource-bound world in which patient work happens. The Glasgow case would have stood out because there were preserved items with potential. That potential did not guarantee a result, but it made a renewed attempt worthwhile. You can feel the quiet hope in such a decision. It is not a promise to the family. It is not a promise to the public. It is an agreement to ask again, using tools that did not exist in the same way before. Sometimes asking again is the first humane act. When the answer began to form, it had to be protected from overstatement. We keep returning to that because overstatement can harm old cases. It can give false comfort. It can create weaknesses in court. It can make families feel lifted and dropped again. The careful investigator speaks in steps. We have a result. We are reviewing it. We need to do further work. We will tell you what we can, when we can. These sentences may sound restrained, but restraint can be kindness. You can imagine Mary's relatives hearing cautious updates, perhaps years after they had learned to expect little. The sound of a phone ringing can change its meaning in that situation. A message from police may carry fear, hope, and fatigue all at once. Someone may stand very still while listening. Someone may write down a name. Someone may repeat the information to another family member later, trying to keep the words steady. Long-awaited news often has to be absorbed slowly. For investigators, contacting family also restores the moral center of the file. It reminds them that their work is not only about achieving a conviction, it is about serving people who have waited in the shadow of an unanswered death. That service requires accuracy, patience, and ordinary decency. It may include explaining technical evidence in plain language, acknowledging delays, and making space for emotion without trying to manage it away. In the Glasgow case, that human work sits beside the forensic work. The courtroom then becomes the public place where private waiting meets formal decision. You can see the room again, not vividly in the sense of drama, but clearly enough to feel its stillness. The benches are hard. The papers have straight edges. Voices are directed to the judge, the jury, the witness, the record. Every answer matters. Every question has a shape. The file that spent years in storage is now being spoken into a space where the law can respond. Courtrooms can be difficult places for old grief because they translate lived pain into admissible parts. A family may know Mary through love, habit, and memory, while the court must know the case through evidence. That difference can feel cold, but it serves an important purpose. The court cannot decide by grief alone. It must decide by proof. In that requirement, there is protection for everyone, including the family, because a true answer must be strong enough to bear scrutiny. The forensic evidence in Mary's case carried much of that strength. The cigarette end was linked to Graham McGill through DNA. Other forensic findings supported the case. The jury heard those matters, not as whispers from the past, but as present evidence explained by qualified witnesses. You sit quietly as those reports are read in your imagination, and you sense how old silence becomes formal speech. It is not poetic in the courtroom, it is exact, and that exactness has its own dignity. Still, exactness does not make the process easy. Old cases often require jurors to understand the limitations of time. They may hear that certain witnesses are unavailable, that certain memories have faded, or that certain investigative avenues once considered important could not now be pursued. They must weigh what remains. You and I can respect that task. It is not simple to decide a matter rooted in another decade, with modern science illuminating parts of a scene that once lay in darkness. The conviction shows that the jury found the evidence sufficient. That is the legal answer. It does not tell us every emotional detail of the family's reaction, nor should we pretend it does. But we can understand, in a quiet human way, that a verdict after so many years may feel like a door finally opening after everyone had learned to live in the hallway. The hallway does not vanish, but the door matters. The answer matters. After such a verdict, police sometimes speak of never giving up. The phrase can sound familiar, but in cold case work it has a practical meaning. It means preserving evidence. It means reviewing old files when new technology appears. It means maintaining contact where appropriate. It means training investigators to see old cases as living responsibilities. It means understanding that a file may rest for years, yet still deserve attention when conditions change. The Glasgow case gives that phrase a physical form. Never giving up looks like a sealed cigarette end. It looks like an evidence log. It looks like a lab request. It looks like a detective reading old statements with patient eyes. It looks like family members carrying Mary's name through decades when no answer came. When you imagine those things together, the phrase becomes less sentimental and more concrete. It becomes work. You and I can also think about the emotional discipline required from detectives who reopen cases. They may feel anger at the length of delay. They may feel protectiveness toward families. They may feel pressure to succeed once a forensic path appears. Yet the work demands steadiness. An investigator cannot let emotion outrun evidence. Even when the emotion is understandable, the file must be allowed to speak in its own measured way. That measured way is part of the sleep rhythm of this telling. We do not rush the answer. Even though we know it now, we keep returning to the steps, because the steps are where the meaning lives. A case solved after decades is not only about who was convicted, It is about how the conviction became possible after so much time had passed. It is about the long bridge between first response and final verdict, and every plank laid across it. In Glasgow, the original city of the file remains present. You can see a tenement entrance after rain, the stone darkened and cool. You can hear a door latch echo in the close. You can smell damp wool, cigarette smoke from another era, and the faint sweetness of tea left too long in a mug. These sensory traces are not evidence in themselves, but they help us remember that investigations happen in lived places. Mary's case belonged to streets, rooms, and weather before it belonged to reports. The later investigation belonged to different rooms, offices with computer monitors, laboratories with clean benches, courtrooms with modern recording systems. Yet the old Glasgow air still seemed to travel through the paperwork. The date 1984 carried its own atmosphere. The names carried their own history. The exhibits carried the room from which they came. As you read, the decades overlap without collapsing. Past and present sit together under the same small lamp. That overlap is why cold case detectives often need historical imagination, though not invention. They must understand how people moved, communicated, socialized, and recorded their lives in the period under review. They must avoid assuming that the habits of the present applied in the past. In Mary's case, the world of public houses, local knowledge, paper records, and face-to-face routines mattered. You cannot understand the file without entering that older daily rhythm. Entering that rhythm does not mean romanticizing it. It means reading accurately. You notice that people in 1984 did not leave digital trails behind them. They could not be placed by mobile phone data. Their bank use, communications, and movements were not captured in the same ways. A detective had to rely on witnesses, physical evidence, and careful reconstruction. That made the preserved forensic items even more valuable once modern methods could finally examine them. The old investigation may have held frustrations that were never fully visible in the paperwork. Detectives might have believed they were close, then watched a lead fail. They might have returned to the same witness, the same timeline, the same uncertainty, hoping a detail would settle. You can sense that fatigue between the pages. It is not written directly, but it is there in the volume of work, the repeated interviews, and the long absence of resolution. For those first investigators, the later conviction may have carried its own quiet significance. Some may have retired. Some may not have lived to see it. Others may have heard the news and thought back to the original room, the original statements, the unanswered pressure of those early days. A solved cold case can reach backward in that way, touching not only the family, but also the officers who once carried the work as far as their time allowed. We can hold them in the story too, without making them central. The center remains Mary, but around her were many people trying to do their part. Relatives, neighbors, officers, scientists, lawyers, jurors, and clerks. A solved case is often a community of efforts spread unevenly across time. Some efforts are visible, others are almost invisible. Tonight, in this quiet reading, we can let the invisible efforts have a little light. There is a softness in imagining the file after the verdict, not because the matter is soft, but because the motion has changed. The frantic early days are long past. The forensic review has done its work. The trial has reached its decision. The papers are no longer searching in the same way. They are now records of how an answer was reached. That transition, from searching to recording, has a particular stillness. But stillness should not be mistaken for final emotional ease. Mary's family would continue to live with memory. The city would continue around them. The public might remember the case when it appeared in news reports, then move on again. That is the nature of public attention. It is bright for a time, then elsewhere. Families do not move in that same pattern. Their attention is not a spotlight. It is more like a lamp kept in a familiar room. You sit with that lamp now, Its light is modest, but it is steady. It falls across a photograph, perhaps, or a folded newspaper clipping, or simply the imagined file in front of you. The Glasgow case, solved after decades, becomes not only a story of forensic success, but a story about keeping someone's name within reach. The answer came late, but the name had been there all along. Mary McLaughlin did not become important when the case was solved. She was important from the beginning. That distinction matters because cold case storytelling can sometimes make the breakthrough seem like the whole story. We are taking another path. We are letting the ordinary life before the case, the long waiting during the case, and the careful work after reopening share the space. The breakthrough is important, but it is not the only meaningful thing. The preserving, remembering, and returning are meaningful too. If you were making notes as a detective tonight, you might write that justice can be cumulative. It builds from acts too small to feel decisive at the time. A careful search, a properly sealed exhibit, a family appeal, a later review, a laboratory test, a clear explanation in court. None of those acts alone contains the full resolution, but together they can carry a case across decades. The Glasgow case is one example of that cumulative patience. You can imagine other files nearby on the same shelf, still waiting. Some may one day move, some may remain quiet. The solved Mary McLaughlin case does not promise every family an answer, but it does show why old files are not simply relics. They are repositories of possibility, and possibility deserves orderly care. That thought can rest with us tonight without becoming sharp. It is a sober hope, and sober hopes are often the strongest kind. The science itself deserves one more slow look. DNA evidence can feel almost invisible because it concerns traces too small for ordinary sight. Yet its impact in old cases can be profound. A tiny amount of biological material preserved on an object can connect a person to a place after memories have faded and witnesses have gone. You cannot see the profile with your naked eye. You see the report, the comparison, the conclusion. The invisible becomes readable through method. That method depends on trust, and trust depends on standards. Laboratories must validate procedures. Analysts must document work. Results must be reviewed. Courts must understand how to weigh them. The public often sees only the final phrase, a match, but the phrase rests on an entire structure of scientific practice. In Mary's case, that structure helped carry the evidence from an old exhibit bag into a modern trial. You and I can appreciate the structure without needing to make it loud. At the same time, we remember that DNA does not replace detective work. It redirects it. Once a profile identifies a possible source, investigators must ask what that means in context. Was there an innocent explanation? Was the person known to the victim? Was the item in a place that mattered? Do other findings align? Are there records that support or challenge the inference? These are old detective questions, asked with a new tool in hand. The Glasgow case was solved because the new tool and the old questions worked together. That is the balance worth carrying into the next part of the file. Modern science brought McGill's name into focus, but the case still had to be built through records, testimony, and legal scrutiny. The future did not erase the past. It returned to the past with sharper instruments and a steadier way of asking. You can hear the turning of another page now. The paper is thinner here, perhaps a later copy, with a cleaner font and darker print. The old and new documents do not match in style, and that mismatch tells its own story. A file that spans decades becomes a patchwork of technologies. Typewritten statements, photocopies, digital printouts, laboratory reports, court documents. Each format belongs to its moment, and together they show the length of the road. There is comfort in the fact that the road was not abandoned. Not easy comfort, and not complete comfort, but something real. The Glasgow case remained capable of being reopened because people and systems had left a trail back to it. That trail was imperfect, as all human systems are, but it was there. You can follow it by touch. Label, log, statement, sample, report, indictment, verdict. Each one a marker in the dark. The family's trail was different. Their markers were personal. A memory of Mary's voice, a photograph kept safe. A story told to younger relatives. An anniversary that never became ordinary. A news update that stirred everything again. These markers do not appear in evidence schedules, but they are part of the wider truth. When the legal answer came, it met a family history that had continued every day without waiting for official permission. We can let the narration slow further around that idea. The official file and the family memory are not the same, but they touch. The file seeks proof. The family seeks the person. The file records dates. The family remembers belongings. In a solved case, the legal process may finally name responsibility, but the personal memory remains larger than the legal frame. That is why respectful retelling must keep its voice low. We are not here to own the story. We are here to walk beside it for a while. You, as the quiet detective tonight, are not chasing excitement. You are rereading carefully, noticing how a case can be carried by ordinary acts of attention. The small lamp, the cool room, the old paper, and the patient return to facts all help the mind stay gentle. The Glasgow case has another quiet lesson about time. Time can damage evidence, weaken memory, scatter witnesses, and deepen grief. Yet time can also bring new tools, new databases, new standards, and new investigators with fresh eyes. It is not simply an enemy or a healer. It is the medium through which the case moved. You and I do not need to simplify it. We can let time be complicated, as it always is. For 32 years and more, depending on the point from which one measures the renewed movement, the case lived in that complicated time. It was not finished, but it was not nothing. There were records. There were exhibits. There were people who remembered. There were family members who cared. There were scientific advances gathering quietly in the wider world. Then one day, the old evidence could be asked a better question, and the file began to answer. The phrase, better question, matters. Cold cases are not always solved because someone finds something wholly new. Sometimes they are solved because someone asks an old thing a question that earlier investigators could not ask. What biological material remains here? Can it produce a profile? Can that profile be compared? Can the comparison be trusted? These questions did not change the past, but they changed what could be known about it. You can imagine the cigarette end again, small and unremarkable, inside its evidence packaging. It did not announce itself. It waited. Around it, decades passed. New crimes were investigated. New officers were trained. New laws and procedures shaped forensic practice. Computers became ordinary. DNA databases grew. The object remained itself. Then, under the right conditions, it became legible. That quiet legibility sits at the heart of Mary McLaughlin's case. There is something almost restful in the idea that an answer can wait without hurry. Not because the waiting is good, but because the answer does not require constant noise to remain possible. The file can sit. The evidence can rest. The question can survive. Then, when attention returns with the right tools, the work can begin again. This is not a promise for every case, but in the Glasgow case, it became true. As we continue, the aftermath opens into professional memory. Detectives who learn about cases like Mary's may carry the lesson into their own reviews. They may be more careful with old exhibits. They may think twice before assuming a sample is too small. They may speak more thoughtfully to families about what modern testing can and cannot do. A solved case becomes part of the quiet education of future investigators. That education is not glamorous either. It may happen in training rooms with pale walls, plastic chairs, and coffee in paper cups. An officer may present the case timeline. A forensic specialist may explain the sample history. A supervisor may discuss family liaison. People take notes. Questions are asked. The lesson settles not as drama, but as practice. This is how institutions remember when they are doing their remembering well. Mary's case also belongs to the public memory of Glasgow, though public memory is often uneven. Some people will remember the news of the conviction. Others will know the case only vaguely. Many may never know it at all. That is all right. Not every meaningful thing becomes widely remembered. The deeper remembrance is held by family, by the legal record, and by the investigators who understand what the case required. You and I, tonight, are holding it briefly in another way. We are reading it as a bedtime file, calmly and without sharpness, letting the long investigation show itself in layers. The goal is not to keep you tense, it is to let the mind rest on patient order. One page follows another, one room leads to another, one decade touches the next. The Glasgow case becomes a slow movement through memory, method, and care. The next page might contain a formal document from the later proceedings. You run your eyes along the lines, not needing to absorb every legal phrase. The language is dense, but its purpose is simple enough. It fixes the accusation in words. It tells the court what must be answered. Legal documents have their own cold clarity, but beneath them is the warm human reason they exist. Mary's life, Mary's family, Mary's name. A case that reaches court after decades also asks society to look at age differently. The age of the file does not make it less important. The age of the accused does not remove responsibility. The age of the offense does not make it meaningless if it has been preserved and tested properly. Time complicates, but it does not automatically erase. That principle sits quietly inside the verdict, and it is one reason cold case work matters. You can see how the courtroom becomes a bridge again. On one side, the old Glasgow evening, on the other, the modern legal decision. Between them, a jury listens. Evidence crosses the space through testimony. The family sits with years folded into the present. The accused hears the case against him. The judge oversees the process. Everyone in the room is living in the present, but the room itself is turned toward the past. The past, however, cannot be fully reconstructed. We should be honest about that. Even solved cases contain unknowns. They may have a legal answer without every minute explained. They may identify responsibility without recovering every thought, every movement, every private exchange. In Mary McLaughlin's case, the conviction answered the central question in law, but some details of that long-ago time remain beyond reach. The file holds what could be proved. That is enough for law when the proof is sufficient. It is not always enough for the human wish to know everything. You can feel that difference softly, without frustration. Human beings naturally want complete stories, but old investigations often offer carefully established parts. The discipline is to respect the parts and not invent the rest. In this narration, we stay with what the file can bear. The rain outside the imagined window has eased now. You might hear water dripping from a gutter, slow and irregular. The room feels a little cooler. The lamp still holds its circle of light. In that circle, the file is no longer only about unanswered harm. It is about the long path by which unanswered harm was brought before evidence, science, and law. The path is sober, but it has calm in it. We can return to Mary's family one more time in this stretch, because their waiting gives the case its emotional truth. They did not wait in a theatrical way. They waited through ordinary life. Through meals, illnesses, celebrations, and quiet evenings when the absence may have felt close. The later conviction did not create their love or validate it for the first time. It simply acknowledged, in public and legal terms, that the harm done to Mary had an answer. That public acknowledgement can matter deeply. It says the person was not forgotten. It says the years did not make the case unworthy. It says the evidence, when finally able to speak, was heard. These are not small things. They are not everything either. But in a cold case, meaningful partial answers can carry real grace. You and I let that grace remain modest, because modest grace is often the truest kind. As the file continues, the practical world resumes around the answer. Appeals may be considered in some cases. Records are updated. Evidence is retained according to procedure. Reports are filed. The public attention fades. Officers move on to other matters. Families return to private life with a changed, but not unburdened, understanding. The machinery of justice is both profound and ordinary in that way. It makes decisions. Then the day continues. The continuation of the day is part of the story too. After a verdict, someone still has to make dinner. Someone still has to walk home through weather. Someone still has to sleep, or try to sleep, with new knowledge settling inside old grief. We do not often include those moments in case histories, but they are there. The human life around the file resumes, carrying the answer as another layer rather than a clean ending. In the investigative world, Mary McLaughlin's case becomes part of the evidence for persistence. It can be cited, informally or formally, when someone asks whether a case this old is worth another look. It can remind teams that exhibits once considered limited may now have value. It can encourage careful storage, better record keeping, and thoughtful forensic review. A solved file can become a quiet advisor to unsolved files. That image is gentle enough to keep. The solved file does not speak loudly. It sits near the others, showing that time did not have the final word in this instance. It does not promise the same for every box, but it refuses despair. When a detective walks into an archive room and looks at rows of old cases, Mary's file belongs among the reasons to lift one more lid, check one more label, and ask one more careful question. You sit with the rows of boxes again. Some labels are crisp, some are fading, some corners sag. The room holds dust, cool air, and the faint smell of paper aging in silence. A detective pulls a file forward, and for a moment, the shelf gives a small wooden creak. That sound could be the beginning of nothing or the beginning of movement. The detective cannot know yet. The only honest thing is to begin carefully. The Glasgow case teaches that careful beginnings matter even when they come late. A review after decades is still a beginning. A lab submission after years of silence is still a beginning. A family update after long quiet is still a beginning. We often imagine beginnings as bright and fresh, but cold case beginnings are older, softer, and more burdened. They begin with the knowledge that time has passed, and they begin anyway. You can feel the patience in that word, anyway. It is not dramatic. It does not promise success. It simply keeps the work from stopping at the edge of difficulty. Witnesses may be gone, but records remain. Memories may fade, but exhibits remain. Methods may have changed, and therefore old material may deserve another look. In Mary's case, that willingness to begin again helped carry the file from silence toward proof. The file under your hand now seems thicker than it did at first, not because we have added pages, but because we have noticed more of what each page contains. The early statements contain voices. The exhibit logs contain future possibility. The forensic reports contain decades of scientific development. The court documents contain public decision. The family statements, where they exist, contain love and endurance. The file is heavy with more than paper, and still, the reading stays calm. You turn one page. You let the next rest flat. You do not force your mind to hold every date. The rhythm is enough. Glasgow, Mary McLaughlin, the preserved evidence, the long wait, the renewed testing, the court. These elements return, like quiet landmarks along a road at night. You know where you are. You do not need to hurry. In the next part of the file, we can begin to look more closely at the patient mechanics of review itself, the way an old case is selected, opened, assessed, and gently disturbed after years of stillness, with every movement made in awareness that the past is fragile and the people connected to it are still living with its weight. With every movement made in awareness that the past is fragile and the people connected to it are still living with its weight. You begin, as a cold case detective would begin, by asking what the old file can still support, not what you wish it could support, and not what would make the story feel complete, but what is actually there, in paper, exhibits, records, and memory. That first question is quiet, but it governs everything that follows. The review of a case like Mary McLaughlin's does not begin with certainty. It begins with inventory. You take the box down from the shelf, feel the drag of cardboard against cardboard, and set it on the table. The lid may resist for a moment where the edges have softened with age. Inside are folders, envelopes, copies, perhaps a plastic sleeve holding photographs. Before any theory is considered, the investigator must know what exists, what is missing, and what condition each piece is in. There is a tenderness in this first stage. Though it is practical work, you do not tear into the past. You open it carefully. Each exhibit number is checked against a list. Each label is read. Each seal is examined. If something has been moved before, the movement has to be understood. The old Glasgow case becomes, for a while, less a story than a room being surveyed in lamplight, with every object placed back in relation to every other object. A review team might create a modern index from older materials. You can picture someone typing names, dates, and exhibit references into a database, while the original paper lies nearby. The keyboard makes a soft tapping sound that the first investigators would not have heard in quite the same way. Yet the task is old-fashioned in spirit. It is the making of order. It is the patient act of helping a file explain itself to new eyes. The old statements may be scanned, copied, or summarized, but they still need to be read as human speech. You sit with one, then another. A sentence that looked ordinary at first may later connect with a forensic finding. A name in a margin may explain why a witness was seen twice. A time estimate may reveal not a fact, but a pattern of uncertainty. Cold case review is partly the art of noticing what earlier work preserved without fully resolving. In Mary McLaughlin's Glasgow case, the review had to consider what the evidence could say now that it could not say then. That does not mean the earlier investigation failed to value it. It means the world of forensic possibility had changed. You and I keep that distinction close. It is easy to judge the past from the comfort of the present, but the patient mind does something wiser. It asks what was possible then and what has become possible now. Once the exhibits are identified, the next question is suitability. Not every old item should be tested, and not every test is worth the risk of consuming material. Some samples are small. Some may be degraded. Some might yield more if technology improves further. A decision must be made, and that decision can feel heavy. You can imagine the quiet of a meeting where forensic specialists and investigators discuss an object no larger than a fingertip, because that object may hold the case's best chance. The cigarette end in Mary's case carried that kind of possibility. It was small, plain, and easy to overlook in imagination, yet it held enough significance for renewed attention. You can picture it not as a dramatic clue, but as a preserved trace in an evidence bag, its label more important than its appearance. The bag crackles softly when handled. The writing on the label ties it to a room in Glasgow and to a date from many years before. When an item is selected for testing, the process becomes even more controlled. The evidence must be transported, received, logged, and handled under procedures designed to protect both the sample and the meaning of any result. There is a calm choreography to it. A signature here, a seal checked there, a record created before the next step begins. You can hear the quiet snap of a secure container closing and the low sound of a door being locked. Laboratory work has its own atmosphere, different from the archive. It is cleaner, brighter, and more precise. The air may smell faintly of disinfectant and warmed equipment. The benches are uncluttered, labels are straight, gloves soften the sound of handling. In such a room, the old Glasgow case is reduced, temporarily, to samples, controls, and reports. That reduction is not disrespectful. It is how science protects the answer from wishful thinking. You sit beside the process in imagination, knowing that no one should rush it. A sample may be examined, extracted, amplified, and analyzed through methods that require both equipment and judgment. The scientist is not looking for a story. The scientist is looking for a reliable result. That difference matters. The story can come later, when investigators place the result back into the file. For now, the work is narrow by design. When a DNA profile emerges, it does not arrive like a voice in a dark room. It arrives as data, reviewed and interpreted. The profile must be assessed for quality, compared with relevant records, and explained within a framework the court can understand. You can see the printed report, its language careful and technical. The old case has not suddenly become simple. It has become newly active, and activity brings more work. In the Glasgow case, the DNA result associated with Graham McGill gave investigators a path to follow. A path is not the same as a completed journey. You have to walk it. You have to check whether it leads where it appears to lead. You have to see what else lies along the way. The result mattered because it gave focus, but focus still required discipline. The file had to be read again in light of the new information. That rereading can change the emotional temperature of a review. A name that once sat nowhere in the file may now become central. Old statements may be examined for indirect connections. Records may be searched for locations, histories, and patterns. The investigation is not reinvented, but reorganized around the new finding. You can feel the desk becoming active again. Papers spread in careful clusters, sticky notes marking places where old facts now require fresh attention. At this point, the detective must be especially careful not to see too much. Once a suspect is identified, every old detail can seem to point toward them if the mind is not disciplined. Patient review resists that pull. It asks, what supports this? What challenges it? What remains unexplained? What alternative interpretations exist? You and I can feel the steadiness of those questions. They are not doubts for the sake of doubt. They are safeguards. The family, if informed of a development, must also be protected from premature certainty. You can imagine the difficulty of that conversation. There may be a meaningful forensic result, but the case still needs further work. There may be a name, but no conviction yet. The officer's voice must be warm without being loose, careful without being cold. Words matter in that room. After decades, a single careless phrase can cause harm, so the updates come in measured form. There has been progress. Further inquiries are ongoing. We will keep you informed when we can. These are not satisfying sentences, but they may be the most honest ones available. You hear them softly, and you understand why they are shaped that way. In cold casework, kindness is not always giving more detail. Sometimes kindness is refusing to promise what the evidence has not yet delivered. As the renewed inquiry continues, investigators may return to old neighborhoods, though the physical world has changed. A building may have been renovated. A shop may have another name. A close may smell of fresh paint instead of old damp. Streets can keep their layout while losing the texture of a particular year. You stand there in thought, looking at Glasgow through two times at once, the city Mary knew and the city the reviewing officers entered later. This double vision is common in old investigations. Maps from the time may be compared with modern maps. Addresses are checked against electoral rolls, housing records, or local archives. Names are traced through marriages, moves, deaths, and changed circumstances. A witness who lived 3 doors away in 1984 may now be found many miles from Glasgow, perhaps surprised to hear the case spoken aloud again. The past does not stay neatly in place. When a witness is found, the interviewer must approach with care. The person may not have thought about the case for years, or they may have thought about it often and never said so. Their memory may return in fragments. The texture of a coat, the time a pub emptied, the sound of Mary's voice, the weather that evening. You listen not only to what they remember, but to how they remember, where certainty strengthens and where it fades. There is an art to asking questions without planting answers. You begin broad. What do you remember? Where were you living then? Did you know Mary? Did you speak to police at the time? Then slowly, if needed, you move towards specific points. The interviewer's notebook stays open. The pen moves only after the witness has had space to think. In the best interviews, silence is not wasted. It gives memory room to settle. Some old witnesses may feel guilt for not remembering more. You can imagine someone apologizing, as if memory were a duty they had failed. A patient investigator does not punish that. They understand that decades are not kind to detail. They also understand that a small, honest memory may still matter, while a confident but shaped memory may not. In this work, humility belongs to the witness and the detective alike. The Glasgow case's eventual strength came not from perfect memory, but from preserved evidence and careful interpretation. That is why the forensic thread remains so central. Yet even when science carries much of the weight, human statements help create the frame. They describe Mary's life, her movements, her relationships, and the original context in which the evidence was found. A DNA result without context is a bright point in the dark. The file tells us where that point belongs. You turn to another document, perhaps a modern review note summarizing actions taken. It may be plain, even dull, with dates of requests and responses, but its plainness is soothing in its own way. There is no flourish here. The case is moving by administration, inquiry, and lab work. A request sent, a reply received, a sample submitted, a result reviewed, a meeting arranged. The rhythm is slow, but it is movement. That movement would eventually lead to McGill being formally accused. Before that, investigators had to ensure that the evidence met the threshold for action. Decisions about arrest and charge are not only investigative decisions, they are legal ones, shaped by what can be proved and how. You can imagine prosecutors reviewing reports, asking questions, requesting clarifications, and testing whether the case can bear the pressure of court. That pressure is necessary, especially after such a long delay. Old cases can be vulnerable in court because the defense can point to lost time. They may question evidence handling, memory, alternative possibilities, and the fairness of trying a case so many years later. These are not merely technical obstacles. They are part of the legal system's promise that even serious allegations must be proved properly. The prosecution must answer them with records, science, and coherent reasoning. In Mary's case, that answer proved strong enough. The preparation for trial must have involved many quiet hours. Bundles assembled, reports checked, witness lists refined, scientists prepared to explain their findings. Officers refreshed themselves on old material. Lawyers shaped the order in which the story would be presented. You can see the high stacks of papers tied or clipped, the pale tabs marking sections, the faint smell of toner, and the careful way someone checks that every page is where it should be. For the family, the approach of trial may have brought its own long nights. Waiting for a case to be solved is one kind of strain. Waiting for a trial is another. Dates can change. Legal issues can arise. The process can feel slow even after decades have already passed. You and I hold that gently, because patience imposed by a legal timetable is not the same as peace. It can be tiring, even when it moves towards something necessary. When the trial begins, the file becomes a public record in motion. Witnesses are called. Exhibits are referred to. The judge gives directions. Jurors listen. The courtroom has a different light from the archive and the laboratory. It is more formal, more watchful. The sound of paper there carries farther. A cough may feel too loud. Every ordinary movement seems aware of the seriousness of the place. Mary's name would have been spoken many times. Each time, the legal process returned to the person at the center. You can imagine the family hearing it, perhaps with mixed feelings. A name can comfort, and it can wound. It can keep someone present, and it can underline the absence. We say Mary McLaughlin's name in this narration for the same reason the court had to say it, because the case is about her before it is about any evidence. The forensic testimony may have been difficult for lay listeners, but it would have been presented step by step. What was recovered, how it was preserved, what was tested, what profile was obtained, how that profile was compared, what conclusions could be drawn. You and I can hear the calm cadence of that explanation, the scientist pausing when needed, the lawyers asking for clarity, the jury making notes. The answer is not rushed into the room. It is built there. In such testimony, the cigarette end becomes almost symbolic, though in court it remains simply an exhibit, a small discarded thing, kept because someone understood that crime scenes must be preserved, eventually connects the old room to a named person. That is a powerful idea, but it is powerful in a quiet way. The object did not reveal itself through drama. It remained in storage until method and attention were ready. There may also have been evidence from other preserved materials, supporting the prosecution's case. We keep the detail gentle, because the purpose here is not to dwell on harm. The important point is that forensic findings from items associated with Mary helped the court understand the connection being alleged. The dignity of the retelling lies in focusing on the patient route to proof, not on the suffering that made proof necessary. The defense would have tested the evidence, as it should. Questions may have been asked about contamination, interpretation, or innocent explanation. Cross-examination can sound adversarial, but it serves a function within the process. It asks whether the evidence holds when pressed. In an old case, that pressing can be especially important. You sit with it calmly, knowing that proof becomes more meaningful when it has been examined closely. The jury's role was to listen through all of that, then retire and consider. You can imagine the deliberation room only in general terms. A table, chairs, papers, water, perhaps a window with a muted view. Jurors bring their notes, their questions, and their responsibility. They do not carry the family's whole grief, and they do not carry the investigator's years of work in the same way, but they do carry the duty of deciding what has been proved. When they convicted Graham McGill, the legal uncertainty ended. The old Glasgow case had crossed into a different state. It was no longer officially unresolved. That does not mean every question dissolved, but the central matter had been answered by a jury. You can let the sentence rest in the room without making it sharp. After so many years, even a clear answer can feel heavy, like a bell heard from far away. Sentencing followed the conviction, and that too belongs to the process. Courts speak not only to guilt, but to consequence. For families, sentencing can be another difficult day, because it recognizes seriousness while also confirming that nothing imposed now can recover the lost years. You can picture the same courtroom light, the same papers, the same quiet concentration. The sentence becomes part of the record, and the record becomes part of how society remembers the harm. Afterward, outside the court, the weather may have been ordinary. That ordinariness often surrounds major moments. A family steps into daylight or rain. Reporters may wait. Officers may speak. Traffic continues. Someone checks a phone. Someone breathes out after holding themselves steady for too long. The world does not pause long enough for the size of the moment, and yet the moment is real. It enters the lives of those who have waited. The public may read the case in a short article, but the file contains decades. That difference is one reason long-form retelling can be useful when it stays respectful. It gives time back to the process. It allows the listener to feel the slow work behind the headline. The Glasgow case was not solved by a sentence. It was solved through persistence that ran beneath public notice for years, and through evidence that kept its meaning in silence. You and I stay under that public surface a little longer. We sit with the clerks who preserved records, the officers who reviewed them, the scientists who tested the material, and the family members who never stopped living with Mary's absence. None of these people need to be made dramatic. Their roles are meaningful because they are real. A cold case is carried by ordinary professionalism and ordinary love, both of which can be stronger than they first appear. There is a particular kind of grief in delayed justice. It asks people to live without an answer long enough that the lack becomes woven into daily life. Then, when an answer finally comes, it disturbs the weave. That disturbance may be welcome, but it is still a disturbance. The family has to make room for new knowledge inside old loss. We can imagine that gently, without pretending to know the private shape it took for Mary's relatives. For investigators, delayed justice may bring satisfaction mixed with reflection. They may think about what could have been done earlier, even if earlier tools were not available. They may feel relief that the evidence survived. They may feel respect for the first officers and sadness for the time the family endured. Cold case victories are rarely simple celebrations. They are quieter, more layered, and more aware of cost. The Glasgow case also invites us to think about preservation as an ethical act. Evidence storage is not glamorous, but it is a way of refusing to let a victim's case become unreachable. Every label, seal, and log entry says, in effect, this may still matter. That attitude is not sentimental. It is practical respect. In Mary's case, practical respect became essential. The future answer depended on the old decision to keep what might one day speak. You can apply that thought to the first hours of any investigation. The people who enter a scene are working for both the present and the future. They gather what the current inquiry needs, but they also preserve possibilities that may not yet be understood. A print might be unclear now. A trace might be untestable now. A witness might not seem central now. Later, under changed circumstances, the meaning can shift. Patient work leaves room for that shift. Mary's cigarette end is an example of a small possibility left open. The future walked through it. You can hold that image quietly. Not a grand doorway, but a narrow opening, almost missed, wide enough for science and persistence to pass through. The case did not transform because the object looked important. It transformed because the object was kept, and because later investigators understood that old evidence can become newly useful. As the night deepens in our imagined study, you may hear the soft turn of another page. The file is still open, but your mind can rest on its rhythm. The Glasgow case moves from life to loss, from first investigation to storage, from storage to review, from review to science, from science to court. Each movement is deliberate. None of it needs to be hurried. The quiet pace is not avoidance, it is respect. A detective reviewing the case might also think about the relationship between place and memory. Partick, Glasgow, the flat, the streets nearby. The places Mary may have gone that evening all become fixed in the file, but in real life, places continue changing. Paint is refreshed, tenants move, shops close, roads are resurfaced. The physical world does not freeze for an investigation. That is why photographs, sketches, and early notes matter so much. They hold the place as it was. Old photographs have a special texture. You can imagine their matte surface, the slightly muted colors, the edges softened by handling. They may show rooms that no longer exist in that form, furniture long removed, wallpaper patterns from another decade. In a cold case review, such images are not morbid curiosities. They are records. They help later investigators understand spatial relationships, object placement, and the atmosphere of a room they cannot enter as it was. The photograph is handled carefully, perhaps with clean hands or gloves, then placed flat on the desk. You look at it not for shock, but for orientation. Where was the door? Where was the window? What items were visible? What could have been touched? Which objects were collected? The image is silent, but it helps the file keep its bearings. In the Glasgow case, as in many older inquiries, such bearings would have helped modern reviewers return to the original context. Context is the word we keep circling. DNA evidence needs context. Witness statements need context. Dates need context. Even silence needs context. An old file can mislead if one detail is lifted away from the rest and made to carry too much. Patient detective work is the opposite of that. It places details back among their neighbors. It asks what they mean together, and it waits before deciding. That waiting is not passive. It is active restraint. You resist the easy conclusion until the harder one has been tested. You resist the tidy story until the untidy facts have been honored. In the Glasgow case, the eventual conclusion was strong because the route to it passed through review, forensic testing, legal preparation, and trial. A name did not simply appear and end the matter. The name had to be proved. You can feel the proof forming slowly, like a photograph in an old developing tray, though the actual science was much more modern. First, a faint shape, then stronger lines, then enough detail to see what is there. The image is not rushed. If you pull it too early, you lose clarity. Cold case work asks for that same patience. Let the evidence develop. Let the record be checked. Let the court hear it properly. The metaphor fades, and we return to the desk. The file still smells of paper. The lamp still hums faintly. The chair creaks when you shift. Outside, Glasgow is quieter now, but not silent. Somewhere, a car passes through wet streets. Somewhere, a late window glows. The city that held Mary's life, and later held the investigation into her death, continues as cities do. The file captures only part of it, but that part is enough for tonight's careful reading. A cold case review also depends on prioritizing what can still be done. Investigators may list actions, verify storage, submit exhibits, trace witnesses, review suspect histories, check old intelligence, consult prosecutors. Each action seems simple when written down. In practice, each may take days, weeks, or months. A witness may be difficult to locate. A report may require specialist interpretation. A legal question may pause progress. The written list is tidy. The lived work is less so. You can imagine the action log in Mary's case growing line by line. Request submitted, response pending, exhibit located, family updated, forensic report received, further inquiry required. There is a quiet satisfaction in such logs, because they show motion without exaggeration. They are the heartbeat of an investigation after the early urgency has gone. Each entry says, the file is still being worked. The question is still being treated as worthy. The worthiness of Mary's case did not depend on public attention. That is important. Some cases become widely known, while others remain mostly local or private. A case's moral weight does not rise or fall with fame. Mary's family needed answers, just as much as any family in a nationally known case. The Glasgow file deserved care, because Mary deserved care, not because the public was watching. Cold case work, at its best, understands that. This is another reason the narration stays low and even. We are not trying to make the case famous through drama. We are trying to keep it present through attention. Attention can be gentle. It can be exact. It can let the facts breathe without pressing them into spectacle. You, as the listener detective tonight, are not consuming the file. You are sitting with it, and that difference gives the story its calm. The legal record ultimately names Graham McGill as the man convicted of Mary McLaughlin's murder. That fact belongs plainly in the file. Yet even when responsibility is named, we do not turn the story toward him as its center. He is part of the answer, because the evidence and jury made him so. But the human center remains Mary, and the investigative center remains the patient work that carried the truth forward. It can be tempting, in crime stories, to focus on the offender, because that is where a certain kind of curiosity gathers. We avoid that path here. The more meaningful question for tonight is not how to magnify the person convicted, but how to understand the work that finally made conviction possible. Evidence, preservation, review, science, court, family endurance. These are the quiet pillars of the Glasgow case, and they are strong enough to hold our attention. You turn another page, and perhaps this one contains a timeline. Timelines can look clean, but they are made from many uncertain human moments. Mary is last known alive. Concern is raised. Police attend. Evidence is collected. Statements are taken. Years pass. Evidence is reviewed. A profile is obtained. A suspect is identified. A trial is held. A verdict is reached. Each line seems brief, but behind it are rooms, conversations, pauses, and waiting. A timeline is useful because it gives the mind a path. For sleep, it can also feel steadying. You do not need every detail at once. You only need the next line, and then the next. The Glasgow case becomes a sequence of patient returns. Investigators return to the flat through photographs. They return to witnesses through statements. They return to evidence through testing. They return to Mary's name through the pursuit of an answer. The passage of decades makes the sequence wider, but not less coherent. 1984 remains the origin point. The later forensic review becomes the hinge. The conviction becomes the legal resolution. Between those points are long intervals where the file seems still from the outside. But stillness, as we have noticed, can contain preservation. It can contain memory. It can contain the possibility of future action. You can imagine a younger detective being assigned to assist with the review, someone who did not know the original case and may have been born after it began. They open the file with fresh eyes, but they are entering a room built by others. The first investigator's notes guide them. The evidence logs guide them. The family's continued concern guides them. In cold casework, fresh eyes are useful only when they are humble enough to learn from old hands. That exchange between generations is quiet and important. An older officer may remember the area as it was. A younger officer may know newer databases or forensic procedures more fluently. A scientist may explain what a sample can now yield. A prosecutor may identify what evidence will matter most at trial. The case moves forward when these forms of knowledge meet. No single perspective is enough. In the Glasgow case, that meeting of perspectives brought Mary's file into the present. It did not remove the age of the case. It made the age workable. The old materials were not treated as relics, but as evidence still capable of meaning. That attitude is central. A cold case becomes hopeless only when everyone stops asking what remains possible. Here, someone asked again, and the question found an answer in preserved trace evidence. As we near the next slow turn in the narration, the atmosphere can remain with the archive for a moment longer. The lid of the box is placed aside. A folder is lifted. The table surface is cool under the wrist. A page has a faint crease where it was folded years ago. The detective smooths it gently, not to erase the crease, but to read across it. That small motion feels like the whole practice of cold case work. You do not erase time, you read across it. You accept the fold, the fading ink, the missing witness, the changed street, the family's long wait, and still you ask what can be known. That is the quiet discipline at the heart of Mary McLaughlin's solved Glasgow case. The past is not restored to freshness. It is approached with enough care that it can still offer what remains. From there, we can let the file guide us into the lived experience of waiting, not only for police and scientists, but for the people around Mary, whose years with the unanswered case moved far more slowly than any official timeline could ever show. For Mary McLaughlin's family, the waiting did end in one important way. Graham McGill was convicted of her murder, and the Glasgow case is no longer an unsolved file, sitting silently in storage. The answer came through preserved evidence, modern forensic work, and the steady patience of people who returned to the old materials when the science was finally able to read them. That truth does not give back the missing years, and it does not soften every private grief, but it places responsibility where the court found it belonged, after a very long and careful silence. So now, in this quiet room of thought, you can let the file rest without feeling that something has been left unfinished. The law has spoken in Mary's case. Her name was carried through the decades, through paper records and sealed exhibits, through the cool air of archive rooms and the clean light of laboratories, until the old question no longer had to remain unanswered. There is gentleness in acknowledging that, not as a perfect ending, but as a true one. The last sound is not a gavel and not a headline. It is only the soft closing of a folder, the small breath of paper settling against paper, and the faint hush of rain outside a Glasgow window. You have followed the case as slowly as it needed to be followed, and nothing more is asked of you now. The file can be still, Mary's name can be held with care, and the night can grow quiet around it.